Jesus, as you know, was a carpenter, or maybe a stoneworker, or a laborer, something like that. The word in Greek, even though in English we always have translated it carpenter, like someone who works with wood, the Greek word tekton, from which we also get the word technology, means laborer with hands, someone who works and builds and makes things. And in Jesus' day, in that part of the world, it was more likely that he was sort of a handyman or maybe a stoneworker, someone who built things because there wasn't much wood to use. So whatever Jesus was, he was not a sailor. He was not a fisherman. He probably, having grown up around the Sea of Galilee, which is actually not a sea but a lake, all these things that are not really what we say they are. It's a big lake, but it's not a huge lake. It's not a sea. But Jesus grew up around the Sea of Galilee. He certainly had been on boats before. He had probably even as a young man or as a teenager maybe helped friends and family members with fishing. He certainly knew something about boats, but he's not a fisherman. The disciples, at least some of them, were in fact fishermen. They had lived and grown up on boats. They'd been on the water almost every day of their lives. Their fathers and their grandfathers and those before them had probably taught them about how to live life on the water. So I'm always amused by this story in Mark's gospel where these fishermen, these men who've been on a boat most of their lives, go out in the evening at Jesus' direction to sail across to the other side of the lake and get themselves caught in a storm. And they begin to fear for their lives. And it would be easy to look at that story. I've often looked at that story and thought, you silly disciples. Isn't that human nature? We get so scared so easily. But maybe they were right. These were not men who would have likely been panicky at a small set of waves coming in. If they thought they were in trouble, these men who had been in boats all of their lives probably knew what they were talking about. They knew the real danger they were in. And so when they wake Jesus up, who's taking a nap, by the way, naps in the Bible, always good. Taking a nap in the back of the boat, Jesus chastises them and says, why are you afraid? And then he speaks those words of command to the oceans. It says, peace, be still. And then suddenly everything is calm and smooth, and they're, freaked out. Understandably. Who is this? They say. But I wonder if Jesus is not chastising them for fearing the storm, but for something else. I have to confess, I've lived in Oregon now 16 years. I've lived in Oregon almost as long as I lived in Texas. And I love it here. But one of the things that never ceases to amuse me is listening to weather reports about rain. Because people will, the weather forecasters or the weather reports that you might read will say things like, serious rain expected tomorrow, up to half an inch accumulation is possible. And it makes me laugh every time, because in other parts of the world, like Texas, where I grew up, and lots of other places in the southeast, and of course other parts of the world, around the world, you can get feet of rain in a day. Several inches is not unheard of. It's a whole different weather system, of course, because of the geography of that part of the country versus this. But I've been in some serious storms because I grew up in that part of the world. We don't get many of those big, heavy thunderstorms. Every now and then we get a really nice, good, hard rain. But very seldom do we get the kind of big, giant thunderstorms that really are life-threatening. I've never been in a tornado, but I've been in lots of tornado warnings. And I have lots of family members who've been in and near tornadoes and hurricanes. So storms really can be life-threatening. They can be dangerous. And they don't even have to be those huge thunderstorms or a tornado to be problematic. I've shared the story before of a day on my Scotland pilgrimage. This lonely walk a long way from anything else. And it was, as soon as I walked outside, it was raining sort of a little bit down, but mostly sideways. And it wasn't cold, but it was cool. And I was walking on a section of my route that was miles from another village or anybody else as far as I could see. And as I walked, it wasn't long before I got soaked through my jacket, and it wasn't long before I came to a big creek to cross, and I thought, this will be quick. I've got my nice waterproof boots on. That was dumb, because the creek was deeper than normal, and water poured in over the tops of my boots. Waterproof boots aren't waterproof once the water's inside. I got to the next creek crossing, and my feet were already wet, and I thought, well, here we go. And that was also dumb, because whatever drying had started to happen was completely undone. And I began to realize, especially as I looked at the trail that was going to continue along this big, long loch, and there was no place to find shelter, that I was going to be in the wind and the rain for a long time. And I began to notice that I was shivering, and that there weren't many places to get out of the elements. It wasn't a massive storm, but it really was beginning to get to be a dangerous situation. And I tucked up into an old sheep barn. The photo, if you opened our worship materials from the East Spire, that photo is from inside that sheep barn looking out at the rain on that day. And it was only after I got out of the rain that I began to realize that not only was I shivering, but that I couldn't stop shivering. And I could feel myself, my brain, not thinking as quickly as I'm used to it working. And realizing, I'm really wet, I need to change clothes. But it taking literally 5 or 10 minutes to go from hearing that in my brain to following through and actually getting clothes out of my backpack to put on. Finally, it dawned on me that one of the things that you need when you're beginning to get to that early stages of hypothermia is calories. And I happen to have in my backpack a nice, high-protein, high-calorie chocolate chip cookie, which I opened and I ate, and almost immediately began to feel better and to function better. Claire loves to tell that story as the time that a cookie saved my life. Which is not entirely wrong, to be honest. It wasn't a huge storm, but it was dangerous. And it was only when I got myself into a place of shelter so that I could think a bit, so that I could pause a bit, that I could begin to take care of myself and to address the situation I was in. I've been in other bigger storms. I've been driving in storms that rained so hard that your windshield wipers could not clear the water enough to see the car in front of you. And when that happens in Texas, what you'll find is everyone pulled over on the overpasses on the highway so that the roads that go over provide some shelter, and there will be 5 or 6 or sometimes more cars pulled over off the highway to find that place of shelter while the storm passes. There are real storms in the world and in our lives, and there are things that are storms, but not weather storms. Storms that come up on our lives unexpectedly, or sometimes that build slowly. Excuse me. That batter us about, that put us in danger. There are lots of storms in our lives. whether it's a diagnosis of cancer, an unexpected surgery, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job. Excuse me. Storms come into our lives all the time. I don't know anybody who's ever had a life without any difficulty. Jesus never promises those who follow him a life of ease and comfort and absolute freedom from any kind of distress. Jesus doesn't say, come and follow me and everything will be peachy keen. Jesus only promises that the storm is not the end and that we are never alone. And maybe that's what happens in that moment in the boat with the apostles. They wake Jesus up and they don't say, yo, there's a big storm, we need some help. What they say is, do you not care that we're dying here? And that's a different kind of problem. They feel abandoned by Jesus. Do you not care? Not, can you help? Not, we're feeling overwhelmed. Not, we're scared. What they're fearful of is that Jesus doesn't care if they die. There are times in many of our lives when we feel utterly abandoned by God. Do you not care that this is what's happened to me? Do you not care that I'm dying here? Do you not care about the injustice that is happening in my life and in our world? Do you not care? Job is a remarkable book that asks some of those very same questions. Do you care? Job is faithful and righteous, and he loses almost everything of significance and importance in his life, including his children. Everything is gone. Job's wife says, look, curse God and be done with it. Give up on this idea that God cares about you and die so that you don't suffer anymore. And Job refuses. And most of Job is written as this conversation between some of his friends and Job. And they accuse and ask and push and cajole. What did you do? You must have done something. And Job says, I'm telling you, it's not fair. And if God would sit down next to me, I would tell him how unfair it is. This carries on for like 30-something chapters. And then finally, in the passage that Randy read for us this morning, finally God shows up. God speaks to Job out of, did you catch this? Out of the whirlwind. Out of the storm, God speaks. Job's life has been utterly devastated, turned entirely upside down. But he will not give up on the idea that God needs to hear what's happened to him. And in fact, his persistence and his faith pay off because he encounters God. Now, it's not the kind of encounter that he might have hoped for. Because in the end, God shows up and says, I am God, and you are not. Where were you when the foundations of earth were laid? Where were you when the universe was set in place? Where were you when we ordered the stars? Where were you when I set the bounds of the sea and said, you may go this far, but no farther? It's not exactly a kind and cuddly kind of exchange. But, in that moment, Job is both overwhelmed by the presence of God and finds at least an answer. An encounter with a God who is bigger and more majestic and more mysterious than he could have expected. It's not an easy solution, but it is an encounter with God, which is what Job had been asking for. And Job at the end says, "You're right. You are God and I am not." There are storms in our lives, physical ones, but also spiritual and emotional ones. And we can feel not only fearful of the storm, but sometimes we do feel abandoned by our loved ones, by our family, by our friends, by our community, by God. Juneteenth has been a day that has been passed down from generation to generation in the Black community, starting in Galveston, Texas, in 1865. For that 150, 160 years, that celebration has been passed down until it has been passed not only to those who were there on that day in Galveston, but has spread not only through the Black community, but across our country. And this year finally became a federally recognized holiday, which doesn't make everything better, but certainly is one small step towards honoring the lives of those enslaved people who were for so long so horribly and inhumanely treated by people of our country. It is one step towards, in a very small way, a hope for reconciliation and a setting to rights. The faith of our African American brothers and sisters in the midst of 500 years of oppression, mistreatment, enslavement, is a witness to a deep and abiding faith that weathers the storm, that continues to weather storms day in and day out. The lives and the faith of our LGBTQ siblings who have refused to leave churches that have told them that they are not worthy, but instead work for justice for one another and for themselves in faith communities, is witness to a faith that is deep and abiding and that has weathered more storms than I can imagine. We are called as people of faith not to sit out on the sidelines or to avoid storms. We're not promised a life that is easy. We are promised that we are never alone. That in the middle of storms, God is with us. That if we are faithful, that if we trust, if we listen, if we act with courage and patience and persistence, God shows up. Sometimes we hear God even in the midst of the storm, like Job. And sometimes it's in those moments when Jesus speaks not just to the storm around the disciples in the boat, but to the storm in our own hearts, in our own lives. Peace, be still. And we find shelter and sanctuary from the storms that rage around us so that we can take care of ourselves and others before we head back into the storm. Faith is not a promise that everything will always go smoothly or easily. Faith is a promise that we are never alone and that there are moments of shelter and safety and security in the midst of the storm because Jesus is with us in the middle of those storms. There is shelter and there is safety. Sometimes we are shelter and safety and sanctuary for one another. Sometimes we find it in ourselves. But we are never alone. Peace, be still, says Jesus. And we hear God speaking to us. You are not alone. You are beloved. Thanks be to God. Amen.